Thanks, Scotty. Well, as we've heard, many Ruātoki children were affected by the Tūhoe raids, yet little has been done to help them get over that traumatic experience. So joining me now is the head of the Department of Paediatrics at Auckland University, Professor Ines Asher, who's also a paediatrician, as I mentioned. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Sure.
With the focus on the community and on those four that stood trial, it's easy to forget that there were children that were essentially innocent victims of these raids. What would have been the impact on them?
Yes, for more than 6 years now, we've forgotten the children who were affected. So the stories keep on gradually coming out. But for example, one story was where 3 children were locked up at dawn with their mother in a shed and not offered any food or water, food or drink for 9 hours. They had to beg to go and use the toilet. And eventually, when the armed police with guns let them go, they escorted them into the toilet in their own house. They had to beg to go to the toilet. They had to asked for food and were given none, while the policemen were actually fed themselves. So this is actually, must be one of the worst cases of child abuse by state authority figures in modern times. And I don't think most New Zealanders understand what's happened to those children. And there wasn't just one child, and that would have been terrible if there was, but there were many, many children affected.
That's a very strong statement, state abuse.
Well, I can't interpret it in any other way. If these children had been held by armed offenders in the same way, the state would have immediately rescued those children and given them some help and assistance. And the children would have been on the front page of the papers and on your lead news item. Because it was the state being the abuser here of the children, they've been hidden from view. In fact, it was only this year that a few of them spoke out in the Dominion Post.
Well, let's talk about what the response should have been in just a moment. Let's talk first about what the impact would have been on those kids and what the impact is now, actually.
Right. Well, many of them were taken away from their adult caregivers, their mums and dads or grandparents. Some of those were arrested and subsequently released. So they were trauma and being removed from their homes, shut up in a prison by people whose position they didn't understand. Dressed up as the police were dressed, as you've seen on the TV program. So they would have been terrified.
Because what they would have had in front of them is men in balaclavas and black suits with guns.
Correct, and they were terrified. They would have been terrified. And they would have had no understanding of what was going on. And then they would have felt the awful effects of struggling with their own body's need for food and needing to go to the toilet and the need for comfort. And none of this was provided by
this. Because their caregivers are taken away.
Yes.
And we hear from the queer in that story that a lot of the children suffered effects where they weren't able to sleep at night, where they were scared, where they were dragging mattresses in to be together at night so that they could sleep.
Some children have had terrible fear that's continued. Fear, lack of trust and and shame and lack of confidence. And some of them have had great difficulty returning to their homes or to their community. Just imagine if this had happened where I lived in Devonport, where the whole community was shut down and this kind of thing happened to a family or several families. This sort of thing would be unconscionable, but because it was Māori kids in a place that most people don't visit, they've been treated quite differently and with profound discrimination. So
what are you saying?
I'm saying there's profound institutional racism at play here in New Zealand society, that what happened that day is illustrative of that. This is happening right now, and that we need to really look at ourselves as a society, abide by all the things that we say that we want to abide by, like the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, where we treat all children with equal rights, all of our children exactly the same way. But no, somehow these kids were treated as much, much less than, and still now.
And so you feel they were abandoned? They
were abandoned by the state who abused them.
So what should have been the response? What should have been the immediate response? What should be the response now?
So sometimes traumatic situations happen that are hard to avoid children being caught up in them. The police do have some standards to follow. They didn't follow them on those days or that day. That they would need to it would have been great if the police had come back the next day dressed as ordinary policemen and said, hey, sorry that you guys are upset by this. This is what happens. This is who we are. Let the kids play with the uniforms, touch the guns, see that these were real people who hadn't meant to hurt them. That would have started to help for them to sort of make some sense of what had happened.
That didn't happen. What
No,
has
that didn't
happened
happen.
is that there's been
No.
something of an apology. The Tamati Kruger, as we saw in the story, says that he's been working with police to figure out what an official apology might be, and also whether there should be compensation. I mean, are those things going to make any difference now?
The children's psychosocial well-being has been, profoundly affected here, and some children will be more resilient than others, but some will be continuing to live with fear, mistrust of authority figures, and shame, and that can do awful things to you as you grow up. If kids end up in the youth justice system, will anyone be compassionate to know what they've gone through? I doubt it.
So what advice could you offer? I mean, we're waiting to see what's going to happen with an apology, we're waiting to see what's going to happen with compensation. In the meanwhile, the people of Ruātoki are still dealing 6 years on with the impact of those raids. And as we have talked about, so are the children. What advice could you give to those families now to get through?
I think the families are doing the very best that they can and have done since the raids, and I think there needs to be they need to work out what they feel would be best for the authority figures, which I mean the government and the police, to redress what's needed. And it's a sensitive issue at this point in time, and I think that the help has been inadequate. So I think you'd really need to consult with the families themselves to help, and with appropriate health professionals in a psychological arena, for example.
Well, Professor, we thank you very much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it. It's Professor Ennis Asher from the Paediatrics Department at Auckland University there, Scotty.